our first speaker is Professor Amy Bentley. Amy Bentley is professor in the Department of Nutrition and Food Studies at New York University, a historian with interest in the social, historical, and cultural context of food. Her work focuses on the meanings and uses of food in the 20th and 21st century United States. Selected publications include the award-winning Inventing Baby Food, Taste, Health, and the Industrialization of the American Diet, which was published in 2014, and Practice in Food Studies, 2024. Current research includes a history of food in U.S. hospitals, the role of flavor in human and planetary health, the cultural context of food waste, and an assessment of how historians write about food. Amy Bentley.
Great. It's wonderful to be here. I was just expressing before I came up how I'm still just pumped to be in the same room with people, having conversations after the COVID desert of Zoom, and I'm still feeling the effects of that. It's very useful in some context, but there's nothing like being in the same room and having the side conversations and the pleasantries, and just feels like collegial knowledge in the making. So I'm really appreciative of being invited here and being able to talk to you today about my topic, which I've been interested in for about 10 or 15 years, but haven't had a chance to write on. So this is the kind of the first foray into thinking about the paratext of recipes. And so I'm eager to hear all of your suggestions and thoughts. So basically, this is the focus of my talk. Can we uncover true evidence of a cook's involvement in the recipe, not only through handwritten notes amending recipes, but the smudges, stains, page tears, and other evidence of the recipe's movement from the page to the table by the cook? This research explores the paratext of recipes, shedding light on the materiality of cooking and examining methods that can help us read and interpret their meanings. I was talking to my daughter about this talk and telling her I was going to give this talk, and she said, "Oh, you should definitely use your gingerbread recipe because there's stuff all over it." And I thought, okay, I'll indulge and start with self-ethnography in providing an example of what I mean for all of this. So the case study is this gingerbread recipe that I've made for over 2 decades. This is my beautiful house that I made in, I don't know how many years ago, and this is the current iteration, which are cookies. So every December for the last 20 years, I've pulled out my sheaf of recipes and rifled through it to find this one particular gingerbread recipe that I've used over the years to make gingerbread houses with my kids, and then eventually cookies. And I found the recipe on the quote-unquote World Wide Web 2 decades ago. I think Google had just started to be a thing, and I found it on Amazon. And it was, I don't know why it was on Amazon. It was a recipe. I tried to find it again. I couldn't find it. But it was from the pastry chef Nick Malgieri's cookbook. And I made a copy of it. I printed it out, and I used it. And we started making gingerbread houses with my kids. And I'm very into celebratory, collaborative food-making events, as many of you are, I'm sure, as well. And I wanted to have that experience making gingerbread houses with my kids, and they were very little at the time. And it mostly for self-indulgent reasons, because I find it really fun to do those kinds of things together. But we had a lot of fun. I found the recipe. We made the stiff royal icing. I baked the sides of the walls. We put them together, and then I just bought tons of candy over excess, which is part of the fun, and decorated everyone had their own, I have 3 children, everyone had their own houses to decorate, and we just had a lot of fun making those houses. These are the first houses that they made, my son and my 2 daughters with their houses. It was just really fun, and I'm so excited that I had these pictures I could find and pull them out. They had a lot of fun doing it, but they almost had more fun destroying it at the end, and so this became part of the annual ritual, is taking the houses and putting them in the bathtub, giving them a hammer, and having them smash it. Oh, wait, sorry, before we get to that. So you can see the messy excess, the indulgent icing and candies and decorations, and it was just a whole event that was really fun. This, I think, is a lair for bears. And you can see the little gummy bears, and this is their little house, where they would hibernate over the winter. So we just had a lot of fun being creative using food this way. Then we'd put, this was almost the most fun part, was putting it in the bathtub and then destroying them. And there's something just so satisfying about hammering away at something that you've made and enjoying every moment as they were. So we did this for a few years, and we invited families over to share in the fun. And then I got tired of making 3 gingerbread houses. So we moved to cookies, and we started decorating cookies, and that was also fun as well. And the recipe sort of evolved with the cookies, and which makes sense because you're going to maybe taste a nibble from a gingerbread house, but you're going to eat a cookie. And so I started tweaking with that original recipe to try to make it more suitable to my taste and also more edible. So you can, I highlighted in yellow the markings, the handwritten markings that I made to create a gingerbread cookie that I liked. So I added molasses, eggs, I reduced the soda salt, I added some butter, I think. I bumped up the spices a lot, and the result was, I think, a really delicious cookie. It's dark, it's bitter, it's slightly sweet. I wanted to make it toothsome and soft, not hard. And then when you eat it, you just get this bite in the back of your throat. And this is, I know how medieval gingerbread works, but I was trying to recreate it. Just all of these taste and flavor sensations that create a delicious cookie. And I do think it's delicious. And we gradually moved from removing the icing and the goopy candies, and my children, as they got older, gravitated to this more just spare, delicious gingerbread cookie that we now have. And my friends wanted it; they thought it was great, so I started, giving them the recipe and creating what was Nick Malgieri's recipe and making it my own and calling it my own. Oh, evidence of use. So in addition to the handwritten markings that I made, you can also see the food stains and the crinkled page and the staple at the top when you turn it over and you have the crease. And so it's a well-used, well-loved recipe with a lot of evidence of me on that Xerox copy page. But eventually, friends would ask for the recipe. They said, oh man, this is so delicious. Can I have the recipe? And instead of Xeroxing off that food-stained page, I typed one up all neat and clean. I renamed it. There's a whole backstory to that name, but I'm not going to get into it. And gave them the recipe as if it were my own. And I did not even acknowledge that it came from somebody else, which is definitely an oversight. But I didn't even think like it made a difference. It was just giving it to friends. And so what started as a well-known pastry chef's recipe slowly morphed into my own, or I called it my own. And so my question is it really my own? What are the processes that happen to decide that it was my own, and how much of me is in that recipe? And of course, we're talking about the text of the recipe. I guess also the cookies at the end, but we can talk about them in 2 different ways, or we can talk about them similarly. So I'm using literary analysis called the Paratext to try to understand what happens to that recipe on the page. And this is from a concept from French theorist Gerard Genet, further examined by scholar Marie McLean, who argue that literary paratexts are the signs and fringes which accompany and surround the text. Let's see, I'm just going to put these all out because I can't figure it So it's the body of the story or the text, but it's also it's the fringes around it. So it's the title, the table of contents, the foreword, the index, the afterword, all of those things that surround a text. The signs and the fringes. Paratext can also be non-textual. They can be the border surrounding the text, the whiteness of the page, the texture of the page, the design, of course, and the visuals on the front. All of those things surround and support the text. They have a different, these are called paratexts. They have different status than the text. They cannot stand apart from the text, and they always exist in relation to it. They're devoted to the service of explaining and supporting that text, acting as a verbal frame. The paratext can be disguised to seem part of the text. The tone of it can vary, and it can be playful, full of contradictions, ironic, as well as straightforward and serious. And this summer I read Don Quixote, Cervantes' Don Quixote for the first time. I made the mistake of trying to read it on my phone. That was not good. But what a text, what a set of paratext that is on that book. It's the titles, it's the subtitles, it's the preface, it's the second preface, it's the jokes, it's the chapter headings. This particular edition that I read had annotated notes, and so everything had a reference to it from some other piece of literature or the Bible or geography or history. It was just such an amazing marvel to read and so enhanced by all of those paratexts. So what is the purpose of the paratext? It's in part where the author displays their intentions, where they speak to the reader. Some people call it a final chance for the author to try to shape the text, to prepare and shape audience's perception of it. And so in doing, it helps define the intended audience as well. A title can be an inside joke that maybe some people will get and some people will not get. A cover sheet can be addressing the critics, helping them like, this is what I want you to get from this book. An introduction can be devoted to scholars, a very narrow variety, to help provide a historiographical preface or locate it in a particular branch of literature. These audiences can get it, but other audiences can also read those and interpret different things as well. So anyway, there are further messages to the audience by the author or the publisher, and to try to, it's a last-ditch attempt to like, okay, here's what I'm trying to say, here's what I'm trying to get, here are all the apparatus to support it. It's also a zone of transition and transaction, a strategy better to help the audience have a better reception of the text. It can function sincerely or insincerely. Can you turn it? Yeah. Oh, where was my, oh no, okay, no, that's good, that's good. So it makes perfect sense. We think of cookbooks as literary text, recipes as text, to apply this paratextual analysis to recipes and cookbooks. Cookbooks are more than just loose sheafs of recipes. Cookbooks have a lot of paratextual apparatus to them. Titles, preferences, tables of contents, the little chatty descriptions that go before a recipe that help you have feelings or connections to a recipe. And this is going on, this happens in medieval cookbooks, it happens in early modern cookbooks as well. As I was exploring this subject, there's definitely some really interesting, important scholarship out there on the paratextual apparatus of cookbooks that are exploring those very things, the table of contents, which is super interesting. But I'm interested in going a step further and looking at the handwritten annotations and even the food smudges and tears as paratext and seeing if we can analyze them as paratext. Yeah, you can turn it. So this is an example of a traditional, we could call it paratext for a cookbook. And this, of course, is the Jerusalem cookbook, Ottolenghi and Tamimi, which has a lot of really interesting paratextual apparatus. And just I've pulled out one as an example, a comment about ownership. So as you can imagine, a pretty charged topic, food in Israel-Palestine. And this is an Israeli Jew and a Palestinian Arab, Muslim, I'm assuming, who are writing a cookbook together, who need to write a note about ownership of this food, given its explosive political nature and the controversies. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to like preempt any criticism, locate where they are in this whole argument and debate. Look, we know this is charged, we're doing it anyway, and here is our statement of ownership and philosophy. So the paratext, the traditional paratext, can be very helpful and important in cookbooks. Yeah. Okay, so I'm looking at the handwritten markings. Just go with it, see what's there. Okay, so these handwritten markings, the annotations, the one that I showed you in my gingerbread recipe, do many things. We know that, first of all, they reveal these things: evidence of the user's thoughts, feelings, and actions, evidence of a natural process. Okay, we'll get to that in a minute. Okay, so cookbooks tell us a lot about cookbook writers' values and intentions, but they don't tell us a lot about the user, the cook, how that person thinks about and uses that cookbook and that recipe, because it's really reflecting the authors. So the handwritten annotations are really valuable, important clues that help us understand how people use recipes, how people use cookbooks, what they think of them, how they feel about them. And it feels like a gold mine for research. And again, I'm looking for research. There's definitely some out there. Linda Murray Burzak wrote an amazing article and then compiled a book about these very things. She used her mother's recipe collections, these 3x5 cards she kept for decades, and she quips, "My mother never read a recipe that she liked at first and just went to town kind of modifying and commenting and used them basically as her diary, would write the dates when she cooked them, who liked it, who didn't, what she would do next time." And what a gold mine, a treasure trove of information for a historian to try to figure out how people understand and use recipes and cookbooks. Looking at my time. Oh, okay, I'm running out of time. Okay, so it's evidence of a natural process. In fact, sometimes cookbook authors encourage their users to adapt a recipe, to use what you have on hand, to substitute. If you have an ethical or religious food taboo or prescription. And so what we can read from these handwritten annotations is what happens already when we use recipes and cook. And we're just watching it happen, or we have evidence of it happening. Recipes exist in a perpetual state of exchange, where we heard a lot about that this morning, and we'll continue to hear about that. A recipe is a fixed moment in time, and there was a history before, and there's a life afterward, and it's going to change. And then Fleitz wrote a really great article and talked about active engagement with the recipe, that these handwritten annotations are evidence of food literacy, of taking something and making it of your own. And she puts a feminist spin on it, and she sees it in part as a feminist act of resistance, of like taking the text and making it your own, which I agree with, but I think it can be more than that, or something different than that. It can be someone just trying to get food on a table. It can be somebody taking a recipe and remembering how they did it so that they'll do it the same way next time. I always think I'm going to remember, oh, okay, and I shouldn't cook it at 375, I should cook it at 350, and if I don't write it down, I won't remember. So sometimes I think it can be a feminist act of resistance, but I think it also can be not that. Okay, go ahead, move on. There's also found objects within cookbooks as evidence of these, I'll call them paratext. And I was leafing through some of my cookbooks that I had to try to find examples for this talk, and look what I found. Guess when I opened this recipe last? I think it was during COVID when I was trying to like do fancy cooking, you know, so I was like, oh, I'm gonna cook my way through the Ottolenghi cookbook, or something like that. And so it just cracked me up to find that mask in that recipe. You know, I was using it as a bookmark. So that is like evidence that when I write my life biography through my recipes, I will remember that. Also, over there is like something that I ate while I was looking through the Samin Nostrum cookbook, and so there's evidence of some cookie or I don't know what. But anyway, just there are historians who have done amazing work about finding material culture and found objects in archives. And how do we read those? And how do we make sense of those? Which I find incredibly exciting. Okay, we're running out of time. So, okay, food stains and torn pages. How can we incorporate this into our research methodologies? One, we need to get some chemists on board. And I know there's some literature out there. I've already talked to James Malin, who said there was an article just published where chemists are doing chemical analyses of food stains to try to help us understand more of what's going on. Conversely, the absence of food stains. So the Folger Library cookbook collection, I corresponded with the curator, Heather Wolf, and I said, you know, these are early modern cookbook manuscripts. And I said, are there any food stains on them? And she said, you know, we were really excited to try to find them, but there aren't any. And she said they took that to mean that these were not cookbooks in the kitchen being cooked with. They were cookbooks held by the lady of the house, using them as reference manuals to instruct the cooks. And that may well be, but I also wonder how these food stains denigrate a cookbook from a long time ago, and maybe some of them just aren't in the archives, or the cookbook sellers don't deem them as worthy of, you know, being sold or kept in an archive. So you know, it's interesting to think about both the existence of food stains and the absence of food stains. I think we can take these food stains and tears and triangulate them with other methods and provide a full picture. I think one thing, the bottom, I'm just mindful of time, I think what they can do in a cookbook is help us understand how people use cookbooks. And there are people that cook their way through Julia Child and other cookbooks, but most of us, I think the evidence shows, use cookbooks, just one or a few recipes in a cookbook. And when you put a cookbook down and what page it opens up to and which is kind of crinkled, help us understand who uses a cookbook and why and what recipes are being used. So those food stains and tears can provide some further evidence. Okay, now what do we do when nobody's using paper recipes and cookbooks again? So this cooking in the digital age. And I pretty much just use the New York Times cooking app, I have to say, for my cooking. And so what do we do? How do we make sense when more and more cooking is moving to online digital banks and apps? And how do we make sense? Where are going to be the paratexts? Where are going to be these food stains and these tears? And I just had a thought, maybe one of them is going to be in the comments. I just made this split pea soup recipe the other night, and it always cracks me up to look at the comments. The comments are so... are so funny. But anyway, just maybe that's where we can find further evidence of people's use and meaning of these cookbooks. I think that's it. Yeah, let's see. So to conclude, a stained cookbook is a living cookbook with history. I'm sure there's ways to clean it, but I keep it as is. This is courtesy of Reddit. The ones that are extra stained are probably the recipes worth trying. I think that's it. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Michelle King is a professor of history at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She specializes in modern Chinese food and gender history. She's the author of Chop, Fry, Watch, Learn, Fu Pei Mei, and the Making of Modern Chinese Food, 2024. This book was named one of the best books of 2024 by the New York Times, NPR, and Saveur magazine. She's also co-editor of Modern Chinese Foodways, 25, and editor of Culinary Nationalism in Asia, Bloomsbury, 2019. And now we have
Yes. So thank you, first of all, to Simone and Claudia for arranging this fantastic workshop and for inviting me here. Actually, Simone, when he invited me, said, okay, we want you to come and talk about China as a comparison to give perspective to European historians. So that is what I'm doing today. I am here to bring you a different perspective and a different kind of historical and culinary traditions to give some ways of sharpening and thinking about recipes in the European context, of which I know very little. And so, and likewise, today what I'm going to be talking about with you are early, middle period, and late imperial texts. And I myself am a modern Chinese historian. So again, I'm like foreign in many dimensions here today. But one of the nice things about writing about things which you know very little about, it's very easy to make gross generalizations, and you know you can some people here may know more about these things than I do, and so I'm you know happy to see where my gross generalizations may in fact fall apart. So let's see. Okay. So when I was tasked with this idea of like what could a comparison with China bring, I thought, gee, I better bone up on what I know about European cooking and cookbooks and recipes. So I found Henry Noteker's, this online encyclopedia, his article about the history of cookbooks. And I thought, all right, great place for me to start. And so I found these two quotes. He defines cookbooks as primarily collections of culinary recipes, written instructions often based on earlier oral communication. The cookbooks are handwritten, printed, or digitized, you know, et cetera. And that it's during the 15th century, maybe a little bit earlier, that they begin to, you know, in Italy, France, and Germany, and then spread globally. And then elsewhere, he says, European cookbooks, you know, constitute a genre that has put its mark on cookbooks all over the world, independent of which cuisines were described. Of course, as a sinologist, when I read something like that, the hackles go up, and I'm like, really? Is that really the case? Let's investigate. And so what I was thinking was that, you know, Noteker is not wrong in the sense that, yes, cookbooks emerged in Europe, but to think that cookbooks are the kind of the be-all and end-all form of recipe collecting makes us not see other things that don't fit into that notion of what is a cookbook. So a cookbook, since by definition we're talking about the genre that emerged in Europe, of course everything else that comes before it from somewhere else does not look like that. But we say, oh, well, that's not a cookbook, that's not the first cookbook. We might think the same thing about the term the restaurant, right? This is something that emerged in France, we heard it this morning, that emerged in France in the 18th century, et cetera, which means we ignore everything else that does not conform to what was the example in France in the 18th century, when there were, in fact, you know, places that sold items for consumption in China already in the 10th century, right? So this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy that Europeanists like to indulge in is something that I want to push back against. So one of the things that I want everyone to think about, the thing that I am very concerned with in this particular paper is, what is the unit of comparison? What is the most appropriate unit of comparison when we're talking across time and across geographies? Is it the recipe, as is the title of this conference? Is it the cookbook? Is it the ingredient? Is it the dish? What is it exactly that we are comparing? And what do you gain from choosing one particular item over another? And what do you lose? Right? So that's kind of what I want us to be thinking about. So for me, in thinking about Chinese examples, I think it is not, we lose something if we use the term cookbook because there's so many other things that are not cookbooks, but are recipe collections that are very useful to think through and to think with. And so I'm going to give you a really quick run-through of a few selected examples of different texts that do not conform to the notion of what is a cookbook in the European sense derived from the 13th century onwards, but in fact do their own thing. And And I would like to think about, we might think the same way in the term recipes. I think that using the term cookbook and not carrying it forward and backward in time, we should understand it as a historically circumscribed genre, right? Especially we can see that now when all of my students don't use books. They learn how to cook online and TikTok and everything else. I think we need to come up with other words, right? Same way with recipe. If we use the same word recipe for all versions, whether they are oral, whether they are printed, whether they are on video or whatever, we flatten what I think should be actually quite distinct understandings of what is a recipe. So I'm going to talk about 4 different texts, something for everyone, one from early China, one from middle period China, one from late imperial China, and a 4th one, which I'll go back to. And all of these texts are used for different purposes, and not the exact purpose that you might think of when you think of the word cookbook. So the first example I want to share with you are bamboo slips found in Han tombs. And these are from the 1st century BCE, and they're grave goods, essentially. And within these particular graves that they found in Hunan province, they have found bamboo slips, and basically at one point they were a text that had a sequence. They look like this, they're handwritten on bamboo, and it used to be that they were tied together in a particular sequence. But over the course of 2,000 years, the string or whatever it was, the fiber that tied them together has disintegrated. So all you're left with are little separate bamboo slips. So it's an archaeological project, in fact, to resequence them, study them in their fragments, etc. But in these different tombs in the Han Dynasty, there are recipes, in fact, recipe collections. And here are some samples of these different recipe collections, one from the Lady of Dai, Marquise in Hunan, what is now Hunan province, and another from another Marquis different tomb. And so out of 1,300 slips, for example, in this Yuanling tomb, 300 of them are referring to instructions for preparing recipes. Some of them are fragmented, like the one on the bottom, talking about recipes to make slabs of suckling pig. First, butcher the pig, then singe and scrape away the hair, use the edge of the hand with the fingers moving away from you, and then we don't have the rest, but those are numbered, so we know that, there's a sequence of recipes. Also, there's another recipe here about cooking rice, that you essentially double cook it and you flip it upside down and all this stuff. And very interestingly, also with all of these ancient recipes, you also have the kind of parallel phenomenon of people nowadays who want to recreate those recipes, right? So what is going on, or what do people think they're doing when they recreate these recipes? What's the intention behind it? What are people hoping to recapture or imagining that they recapture by making these recipes? In the China Daily, they of course dubbed this, so some students in Hunan University tried to remake this rice recipe using a varietal of rice that was available in Han times, or they imagine it was so, or whatever. They've done the research. I haven't. The conclusion was that, the results were a success, that the rice resulting was deemed loose yet elastic with a pleasing texture and notably lower sugar content, characteristics aligned with today's healthy eating trends. Of course, they're never going to tell you it was terrible, but that's something that also interests me, right? What do people think that they're doing? In the Lady of Dai's tomb, it's not Lady Dai, Lady of Dai. In her tomb, her corpse, which is extremely well preserved, was found with the remains of 138 and a half individual muskmelon seeds, like fascinating, right? And that the bamboo slips in her tomb list all kinds of different dishes and cooking techniques. I'm not sure if we would call them recipes or not. It's more like a food list. But those are like stew mixtures such as deer meat, salted fish, and bamboo shoots, or fresh sturgeon, salted fish, and lotus root. Those are some examples. So what's the purpose of these recipes? They're not cooked with, because they're accompanying you to death, right, to the afterlife, right? Is it for the servants to cook with, but you have to think most servants in imperial China would have been illiterate, right? So who is it actually for? Why is it there? Is it for the woman herself? It's in a man's tomb as well. So who are they for? All we can say is that they valued these recipes enough that they wanted them to accompany them into the afterlife, right? Whatever it was for, we can't really say for sure. And here are just some images of other Han Dynasty tombs with extreme detail in food production, right? This is, they're making here gung, a kind of like stew thing with all these different ways of preparing. And then here they think that this is people making tofu, right? That's what scholars have theorized, that's what they're doing. So a lot of evidence, physical evidence and visual evidence about food preparation in this very early moment. So if we skip ahead several centuries, this is the next text that I want to talk about. And this was a wonderful chance for me to revisit this text that I knew I should know more about. So this was a good chance for me to kind of review what it is. Qi Min Yao Shu, which is translated as Essential Techniques for the Welfare of the People. Again, this is a recipe collection, but it's not just a recipe collection, right? It is, you could call it an agricultural encyclopedia. Again, encyclopedia being a French word. But this was written in the 6th century by the author Jia Sixie, who is an official, a middle-ranking official in northern China, and himself part of a farming family. He's probably from modern-day Shandong province. And although half of his text is derived from quotations of other texts, the remainder is original to him, including farmers' common proverbs, his own talks with farmers and interviews with farmers, and his own experiments. And he writes in his text, "From plowing to pickles, there is no domestic or farming activity that I have not described exhaustively." And indeed, over the course of 92 chapters and over 100,000 characters, it is an exhaustive compendium of what was known about not just food, but planting, grains, food crops, sericulture, forestry, fisheries, everything that was sort of, or not everything, his attempt to be very comprehensive. So what is the purpose of this, right? One of the things that is really interesting to me is that in this text, there's not a cookbook text which has recipes in it, his attempt to be comprehensive, to talk about both the production side and the consumption side, right? Today, in our kinds of, scholarly conferences, rarely do those two sides meet. And in his text, it's all together. And he says that the reason he writes this, and this is another thing I like to think about, what's the purpose of that text? My intention in writing this was to instruct the youngsters of my family, and I did not intend it for educated readers, which is very interesting because only educated readers can read it, right? So it's a very interesting number of different things that are going on in this text. This is an example. There are 280 recipes in this, not a cookbook, agricultural encyclopedia. Most of them are for things like pickles and fermentation and alcohol brewing. And various kinds of sauces. Mostly they're about preserving food, because in a time before refrigeration or other ways of preserving food, you have to think about how do you make your food supply last as long as you can. But there are also recipes for finished dishes, like roasts and dumplings, porridges, even candied fruit and jellies. And this is an example of a recipe for a meat sauce, a preserved kind of a fermented meat sauce. And you can see it's quite specific, right? It talks about measurements in terms of proportionality, 10 parts of finely chopped meat, 5 of starter powder, which is, he will have given you a recipe for that starter powder elsewhere, salt and a cake of yellow mold. Again, a recipe exists for yellow mold in the collection elsewhere. You move it to a pottery jar, seal it with mud, and bake it, and then, check the mixture after 27 days, and if you don't see any more gases yet, then the condiment is ready, right? So, I just, randomly picked recipes that I thought could give you all something to think about in terms of what is known at that time, the idea of measurement and proportionality, right? It's other recipes, as we'll see, actually do have, quantities and stuff within them. Unfortunately, the reason that a lot of non-Chinese scholars will not know about this text is it doesn't exist in English, right? It is only translated bits here and there. I heard a rumor that Vivian Lowe and Donald Harper are translating this text in full, which I think will be great. So if you ever hear about such a translation, have a look, because I think it will be very eye-opening to you what was known about in the 6th century and thinking about food. Another interesting aspect of this is that there's a well-known sinologist and also British diplomat, Endemyon Wilkinson, who was living in Beijing in 2000, and he asked his chef, his Chinese chef, to make recipes based on the recipes from the Qiming Yaoshu, and they did, and he served it to Chinese guests. He didn't tell them where it was from. And what was so interesting is that none of the guests recognized this as Chinese food, right? It didn't look like any of the food they were used to. It does not, so again, underscoring his point that what we understand as Chinese food, quote unquote, is a very late, not invention, but transformation, right? After the 10th century, at least, probably more like after the 13th or 14th century. So again, the idea of like why you would presume it would be the same, because it's simply not. How Confucius ate is not how Chinese people eat today. The other interesting thing is his text is very long-lived. It's not just that it was buried in a tomb and nobody used it for 1,000 years. It has been used continuously and referred to continuously for more than 1,500 years, right? So that even Charles Darwin cited this text because it had been translated in parts or referred to in parts by Jesuit missionaries in their letters back home, and Darwin picked that up as one of the sources he had for writing about China. So it's an extremely well-circulated, well-known book about not just agricultural planting, but also, consumption and eating. So the other example I want to give you of a not cookbook recipe collection is this you may have heard of. It's Yuan Mei's collection called Recipes from the Garden of Contentment, or Sui Ren Shidan. And we can think of this as, it is a cookbook, it does have recipes, but it is also a gentleman's kind of very idiosyncratic view of what you should and should not do, right? What does a man of taste do or not do? Where do I buy the best X? What do I absolutely want to avoid avoid appearing gauche? Is very filled with his voice and his personality, which is, I think, why people love it so much. One of the important things to understand, too, that in a Chinese imperial context, the chef does not matter. The chef is just hired hands, right? He isn't important. It's the tongue of the gentleman guiding those chefs' hands that is the important member of this hierarchical arrangement, right? It's the gentleman who has the taste. The chef, you just hire him to do whatever, right? And so, this is the epitome of that kind of relationship where it's not about the chef, although, Yuan Mei does write an encomium to his deceased chef and how wonderful he was, where the chef, in turn, compliments, Yuan Mei's taste. But you can see his kind of perspective and his culinary judgments when he says that, he looked at other recipes that had been passed on through other Chinese texts, and he said, oh, I tried those, or what he means really is he had his chef try those. And these were offensive and noxious, right? And that they were the product of overextended imaginations of mediocre scholars, which I love, that idea. This is an example of a recipe from Yuan Mei's text. And I chose this example because of all the different things that it illustrates about Yuan Mei's way of writing, right? So it says, chop a good ham into large chunks with the skin on, and braise that in sweet jiu, or alcohol, until they're soft and tender. This is an excellent dish. Note, though, the differences between a good ham and a bad ham are as great as the distances between the heavens and the abyss. There are numerous well-known hams from Jinhua, Lanxi, and Yiwu that simply do not live up to their reputations. These bad hams are frankly no better than dried salted pork. He gives you buying notes, right? Wang San's store in Zhongqingli in Hangzhou sells a very good ham that costs 4 qian per jin. I've had this ham once at the household of Master Yin Wenduan. Its fragrance was so intense that the neighbors could smell it during preparation, and its flavors were uncommonly good. Sadly, I've never had such an extraordinary ham since. And again, this is why people love yuanmei, because you can hear the man's voice and like telling you, do this, don't do that, you know, buy this fish only at this time, only from this place, only from these vendors. You know, it's very appealing. And so as you can see, this image that I looked up off the internet, if you look up anything, yuanmei, and then you put in the name of the dish, someone has tried to make it, right? There are entire restaurants in Nanjing devoted to recreating all of yuanmei's recipes, right? Because it's so appealing. And again, what is going on there? Like, what do people think they're doing? And these are all re-editions of his recipe book. It's so popular. It seems like every few years somebody else has come out with another edition of this recipe book / not recipe, you know, recipe book right? And so to call it a cookbook is a little bit limiting in thinking about what it's doing and what it's performing. I put that forth to you. So the last example that I want to share with you is a thing that you might recognize as a cookbook, because only thing in it are recipes, no other texts. Although scholars think that it is in fact partial, oftentimes with these Chinese texts, they're copied into other texts, they're referred to bibliographically in collections or lists of libraries or things like that. That's how we know they exist and when. But some theorize that we don't have the whole text. But there are 73 recipes in this text, and it's called, in English, it's been recently translated. Sean Chen has translated both yuanmei's text and this text. It's called Madame Wu's Handbook on Home Cooking. That's his translation of it. And the reason we know, even though we can say nothing about the person that wrote this, and you know, scholars even debate, is it from the 13th century? We think so. We think it's late Song, but that's the suggestion, but of course it's hard to verify exactly. But from the title itself is Pujiang Wushi Zhonghui Lu, which the Pujiang is where the person is from, and Wushi means woman Wu, nei Wu, right? Some woman who was born Ms. Wu. And Zhonghui Lu, that's the clue that tells us it's about women. Because Zhonghui, those characters in red, refer to a line in a Confucian classic, the Book of Changes, which is basically stating that women are supposed to stay at home to cook to ensure the prosperity of the whole clan. So that's how we know that it's, you know, pointing towards a woman. And also wushi, that is also nei, that term. So this is an example of a recipe from Madame Wu, or whoever she was. And again, very specific measurements, 5 jin of eggplant, 10 liang of salt mixed together with the lees of alcohol. And then on top of that, to pickle these eggplants, you would put 50 wen worth of copper coins. And then after 10 days, you put them away. And basically, there's a chemical reaction that's happening between the copper and the acid. And then, you know, even when you take the leaves out back, they will remain as emerald green as they were brand new. Unfortunately, there's also lead in those coins, so eating a lot of this would kill you. They didn't know that then, though. So another interesting point of this particular recipe. So, you know, the ideas of what they knew of chemical reactions and fermentations, even without naming it as such. But I want to leave you with one last kind of it's not a recipe, but in the Qiminyao from the 6th century, there is an even earlier text from 100 years earlier that it refers to, which we no longer have. It's no longer extant. It's only through quotes that we know it exists. And this is so evocative. It's called the Classic of Food, and it is supposed to have been written or dictated to another official from the 5th century, and this is what he says, this man, Cui Hao. He says that during my childhood and youth, I saw women relatives carry out their duties, mostly preparing food and drink to serve the elders and to honor the ancestors. They personally performed these duties, although there were servants, right? These elite women are doing it themselves still because their hands have to do it. Then a 10-year period of unrest and famine followed. They could not provide anything but gruel and vegetables to stave off hunger. My late mother said, "The younger generation knows nothing about cooking." So she dictated the book to me. Her gentle words are in the 9 chapters. And it's such an evocative preface, like, of what remains. And then there are some recipes that are quoted in Ximin Yaoshu that we know come from this. That's what I want to underscore, the idea of the thing that looks most like a cookbook, quote unquote, that is most practical and utilitarian in its approach, are authored by women, you know, and that they carry with them the idea of actual hands making the food, which does not, you know, may or may not exist in some of these earlier examples from men. So that's my introduction, very quick introduction to all of you of some various Chinese texts. Is that it? Do I have any more time? Last slide? Okay, last slide. So the thing that I would point out from an outsider's perspective, the thing that are most curious to me about European examples is a couple of different things. So the first is simply the sheer numbers that you all have to work with and play with. You know, that doesn't exist in Chinese history, right? Some scholars estimate that the number of pre-modern titles that do not have to do with tea or wine, you know, those are entities unto themselves, but that don't have to do with tea and wine, maybe about 80 titles. And I know you have in European, amongst European languages, so many more. So the idea of putting that into the context of printing, the commercial aspects, circulation, editions, etc., that's fascinating to me to think about. The other part that's most fascinating is the proliferation of different languages, and that's where I think the projects that you all are embarking on, you know, how do they cross different linguistic borders and later national borders, you know, copying influence, how do this sharpen identities? That is a fascinating thing because Nodeker talks about 55 different, you know, he notes the arrival of the first cookbook in different European languages. You know, how and why does that happen? That's a really fascinating place to put attention in research. Also, the dominance of women as authors and culinary authorities that starts in Northern Europe in the 18th century. Fascinating to me. How does this happen? Is it spreading across Europe? He suggests, you know, this doesn't happen until the 20th century in Southern Europe. Same thing in China. It's not until the 20th century that we're going to see a proliferation of women writing in Chinese about, you know, cookbooks or other things. And finally, of course, the impact of colonialism and imperialism on metropolitan foodways, because we are always forced in Chinese history to be thinking and looking about European, you know, the West, always contending with the West. I would love to see some similar attempts in a European side to grapple with thinking about those questions as well. So that's my, that's what I have for you today. Thank you.
Okay, introducing our next speaker, Fabio Parasecoli. Fabio is professor of food studies in the Nutrition and Food Studies Department at New York University and a fellow at the Institute of Philosophy and Sociology of the Polish Academy of Sciences. His research explores the cultural politics of food, particularly in the media, design, heritage, and international affairs. Recent book of Professor Parasecoli include Gastronativism, Food, Identity and Politics, 22, Practice in Food Studies, 24, co-edited with Amy Bentley and Krishnan Duray, and The Pierogi Problem, Cosmopolitan Appetites and the Reinvention of Polish Food, 2025, co-authored with Agatha Buckwards and Matthews Alava. Fabio, we're all ready.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah. No. I'm gonna turn the camera toward the room and the audience. Let's see. Yes, we can hear you. We can hear you. Yes.
Oh, okay.
So,
Okay.
You should be able to see pretty much everybody right now.
Oh yeah, yeah.
They're
I see.
waving,
I see the crowd.
Okay.
Hello, everybody. It's a little surreal to see Amy there. We saw each other like 2 days ago in our office, but.
By the way, I want the audience to know that Fabio's been nice enough to carve some time for us in a very busy teaching schedule. So we want to really thank him.
No, it's my pleasure. Thank you. Thank you and Claudia for arranging this, and the organizers of the conference. So my point of view is quite different from Amy's and Michelle's, but at the same time, it really builds on some of the elements that they mentioned. I think what I'm going to do is try to explore the boundaries of what a recipe is, which is something that was clear in both talks before, talking about the Paratext. And Michelle mentioned the fact, videos and audios might be different things. Should we put them all together? And if you start looking at the topic cross-culturally, it becomes even more complicated. So what I try to do, and this is just the beginning of a reflection, I consider this a workshop, so I throw out ideas. I hope to get feedback and then integrate the feedback for an article or something we're gonna write. What I'm gonna do is try to put in dialogue food studies, which is already interdisciplinary, with design and design studies, with cognitive science, but also with philosophy, anthropology, or certain parts. There is a whole development of design anthropology that I've been interacting with. And I must thank for this all the designers and design scholars I've been collaborating with in the past few years, starting at my old job at the New School, but also now that I am at New York University. So I'm going to share a few slides so that we can have a conversation. I mean, I will start also, as Amy did, with some sort of autoethnography. This is me in Itapuã, near Salvador de Bahia.
Fabio, your slides are not sharing right now.
Oh, they're not sharing it? Okay, let me try again. I thought it worked. Just 1 second. The joys of How about now?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Second time it worked. All right. And I can see you guys in a little corner over there, which is nice. So this is me in Itapuã, in Brazil, near Salvador de Bahia, where I was vacationing, frankly. But you can see the two ladies sitting next to me, cooks, Afro-Brazilian, and they were amazing cooks. So while I was there, I was trying to ask them to teach me some of the recipes. And at first they were like, no, what is this white man in our kitchen? What does he want from us? And I could totally understand, the dynamics there. But over time, I was there for 2 weeks. We got to know each other. So eventually they decided, yes, okay, we're going to cook for you. We're going to cook with you, and teach you the recipes. But you're going to pay for all the ingredients, and all the staff is going to eat with us at the end. Which was a very interesting way to put it, but I agreed immediately. And so we spent a whole morning. They shopped, so I didn't participate in the learning element of shopping together, but we were together in a small kitchen. As you can see, it was not definitely a professional kitchen, learning how to make different dishes. They asked me not to take pictures while I was working, so my partner did. And it was very interesting because during the process, they were really very generous with their knowledge, but at the same time, they were making fun of me all the time. Like, oh my God, this man cannot even, stir this vatapá. I was making vatapá there. It was sort of a banter that also pointed out power relations and their joy at sort of overturning those, at least temporarily. But at the same time, it really helped me understand how important my physical presence was there. Learning to deal with ingredients I was not particularly familiar with. Sometimes doing movement, doing actions that I was not familiar with. So there was a real the necessity to use my senses, to be aware of the context of the environment. And I had to learn to use my body differently to learn how to use those instruments. Sorry, I went the wrong way. I had also been to Marrakesh, also on vacation, but once again, in the riad I was staying, there was an amazing cook, and I have no pictures of her because she was totally against taking pictures, so I respected that. And anybody who does ethnography knows how frequent this might happen. But anyway, I asked her to help me learn some of the fantastic recipes she was making. And she flat out refused. It's like, no, it's not proper for a man that is not part of my family to be alone in the kitchen with me. At that time, I was traveling alone. And again, I totally accepted it. But she was also generous enough and was like, why don't you come shopping with me? So you will learn about the ingredients, which is very important for Moroccan cuisine, coming from Europe, the US. She thought I was not aware of many recipes, and she was, ingredients, and she was right. So we spent a day in the market of Marrakesh buying, and while we were buying, she was giving me the recipes she wanted me to learn. But, we were in a market. I don't know if you've ever been in this sort of market, a souk. It's not really a good place to take notes or even record. So I was trying to memorize as much information as possible. I bought some of the ingredients so that I could then test the recipes at home. But when I got home, I realized I was totally incapable to do any of the recipes she had explained to me. And so here I started thinking about the limits of an oral transmission of culinary knowledge if it's not accompanied by doing, by an embodied experience in which you switch from sort of the discursive, explicit instruction to turning those instructions into real thing, in real environment, using real thing. Last but not least, this is me cooking with my mother. In the past few years, I've sort of made a point of learning the family recipes. I've actually written an essay about that in 2022, and I even brought my family's banter around cooking at the Victoria and Albert Museum in an exhibition about food and design in 2019. So it's been sort of 6-7 years where I work with my mother, my aunts, my sisters, nephew and niece to learn these recipes so that when the older generation passes away, the recipes are still there. Now, my mother is very cognizant about, the normal, let's call it normal, format of a recipe. So ingredients with quantities, directions. And she's made an effort to write down old recipes that we still have handwritten. And new recipes that she's been learning. She's written them on the computer. They're still not fully searchable. We will have to work with that, but anyway. And so last December, we were cooking together and we were making Christmas cookies and other desserts, as you can see in the picture. And we were trying to follow what she had written. And while we were cooking, she was like, oh no, but you have to do this. Oh no, but this is missing. So I'm pointing to what Amy was discussing before. And so here we were with my sisters adding Paratext. Now I have the word for it on these written recipes. But once again, what was important in learning, it was not just looking at the ingredients and the directions, but actually being there and touching. I mean, this is a cookie filled with sort of a jam mix. You have to have the consistency of that dough right in order for the cookie to come out right. And it's very difficult to put that in writing or even orally, to give instruction, verbal instruction. You have to be there. You have to feel it. You have to have your hand. You have to feel the resistance of that dough. You have to smell it while it cooks to know, when it's ready, when it's not. So basically, I started thinking about this sort of ethnographic vignette, and I started thinking, what is a recipe? Sorry for the slide. I'm not a graphic designer. This is the best I could come up with without, asking for somebody else to help me. But anyway, so what is a recipe in the end? And this also responds to the question that Michelle was asking. And so I was trying to think, okay, can we get sort of a Weberian ideal type of a recipe, sort of an abstract, hypothetical construct that sort of gives you the essence of a recipe. And so I figured out it's just a string of instructions that points out ingredients, different steps to get to a result. And it can be a dish, it can be a preparation, pickling, it can be different things. So if we want, and I'll talk more about that, a string of instruction is an algorithm. If you do this, then you do this. If these are the choices, you do this and whatnot. And this conceptualization of the recipe as an algorithm, I think, becomes very important when we talk about new technologies, AI, but we'll get there. But a recipe in itself doesn't make sense. It has to be transformed into something concrete that becomes, using a little bit the actor-nectar theory approach, an assemblage, an impermanent one. So it's something very contextual, is impermanent. And we know that when we make our own recipes over and over, we change them over time. There might be situations where we have to be creative and figure out how to deal with emergencies and whatnot. Is precisely what Amy was telling us about making, gingerbread houses and cookies. But this assemblage also includes not only humans, but many non-human components. So it's very heterogeneous. So to make sense of this assemblage, we can use a tool that has been developed in ethnography, but also in design ethnography, called a situational map. So basically, you chart this assemblage that include explicit and implicit factors that contribute to the success or the failure of what you're looking at. And that underlines the mutual influence of bodies, materials, and environments in dealing with this explicit discursive string of instructions. So this was a little bit the core of what I was thinking about. And then I went in different directions. So what is part of this assemblage? On the one hand, there is us, humans, cooks, that try to listen to somebody or read or watch and make something based on those instructions. And here I thought a little bit about, I went back to Aristotle to think about techne and poiesis. So for Aristotle, techne was reasoned practical knowledge or skills related to production. So it was not just theoretical knowledge or ethical reflection, was related to production. And then this technique guided poiesis, which is the act of making in itself. So the practical knowledge of how to cook, according to, out ethnography, but also what I've seen, in cooking schools, can only be acquired through the act of making it. I think that's why we don't have online culinary degrees. You have to be in a kitchen. You have to be with other cooks. You have to deal with the machineries and things. So this application of technique into poiesis require many forms of embodied cognitions. And I went back to thinking about Marcel Maus's Techniques of the Body. It's a very old piece from the 30s, but I found it very, very important for thinking about this. What are techniques of the body? It's the way we are raised and enculturated to experience and use our bodies in specific ways that are highly cultural dependent and context dependent. When I explain this to my students, I always tell the story. The first time I was in India at an Onam festival, sitting on the floor in front of a huge banana leaf with all different ingredients, from crunchy ones to soft ones to liquid ones. And I had to eat on my hands, sitting on the floor, this variety of things that I could even not really grasp. And I made a mess of myself. So I had to relearn to use my body in that way. And this is something that has been also examined in food studies. Of course, I have to mention David Sathan's work on Greek cuisine. And at a certain point, in one of his texts, he says that cooking is embodied in the many gestures and judgments, explicit and implicit, which make up the proper way to cook. And this sort of embodied cognition involved the senses in the usual way we think of it, but also proprioception, the perception of one's body in space, in reality, and movement. How does then this body in this space move? In a way, it's we go to phenomenology and Merleau-Ponty's theories, Schusterman's somesthetics, reflection on practices. But there are, in neuroscience, there are embodied cognition theories that highlight how basically there are non-verbal, non-discursive form of knowledge that are based on tactile, think-oriented wisdom and something that we learn only through movement. Also, learning how to use instruments. Neuroscientists have figured out that when you interact with a tool, your neural representation of your own body changes. So the tool literally reshapes perception and action. So there is all this element about bodies, non-explicit knowledge, learning, but then there is the context. So for instance, tools. And for this, of course, design become very important because design, after all, it's projecting your vision or a goal on a specific situation and figuring out ways to get there where you want to get. So to understand our interactions with tool, design and design anthropologies are very important. I'm sorry, it's very early here. I basically rolled out of bed, so drinking my tea. So to understand this, design helps us because it thinks about the affordances of a tool, which is a very important concept in design. So what are the possibilities that are inherent in the physicality, in what the tool is? I don't know. This thing has the affordance of me being able to hold it like this, but also the affordance of being able to do different things. So in cooking, when you learn through this embodied relationship with things and the context, you do basically learn how to take advantages of the affordances, and you adapt your body and its movement to the affordances of those objects. Here we can already start thinking again when it comes to cross-cultural recipes. So I'm Italian and suddenly I have to make, I don't know, tortillas. Do I know how to use the tools? Do I know maybe how to, crush the corn in the traditional way? Do I know how to use the tortillera? These are all things that require this sort of adaptation of the body and its movement to the tool. And very often you have to improvise because there can be unexpected situations. So once again, this sort of theoretical string of instruction becomes something concrete and assemblage in a specific context. In the piece I've circulated, I also, use a little bit of philosophy to back up this reflection. Heidegger, for me, it's been quite important. Actually, in the past few years, I've gone through rereading lots of stuff I knew through the eyes of design, which has been a very interesting experience. So I had read Moss, I don't know, decades ago, but what it means reading Moss through the point of view of design, what it means reading Heidegger. And, in Sein und Zeit, there is the whole idea of the Dasein, the fact that our way of being is with things from the beginning. But not only with things, it's also with space. And he has this famous essay about dwelling that has been used a lot in design studies and in architecture. So we have also to think about the environment, not only the tools, but the space and the built environments. What sort of kitchen you might have to learn to, I don't know, cook on an open fire, cooking on a specific kind of hearth. Try to make a tandoori dish if you've never used tandoori. A naan that sometimes, or some other bread that needs to be stuck on the side of the oven. If you don't know what to do it, first of all, you burn the bread, but also you burn yourself. So the environment of the kitchen, the way the kitchen is structured, for instance, is it tight? Is it large? For instance, I've learned how to cook in my family home in a very tight kitchen. And so I'm able to navigate these situations. When I found myself in a big kitchen, it's sort of a hallelujah moment, but it's easy because I've already learned how to work with 5 people in 3 square meters. And you have to think about the heat also, you know, try to do, I don't know, an ice cream in a very hot kitchen, and all that. So these reflections, I think, should also help us think about different genres. And here, you know, I go back to what Michelle had mentioned. You know, oral recipes, written recipes, video audio recipes, these are just modalities in which the strings of instructions are transmitted. And very often, in neither of them, the recipe takes into consideration these embodied, these contextual, these tools, these built environment elements. You very rarely read about these things. And even if you read about it, what you read, it's explicit verbal knowledge that if you have not been doing and making, it's difficult to reproduce. So I think this reflection can help us think about the nature of various genres of recipes that, yes, are very different, and they offer different elements. But how can we integrate this embodied, this material element?
Fabio, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I hate to say this, but you should wrap up in 2 minutes.
I'll wrap up now. There we go.
Thank you so much. We're gonna have
This is the last slide. So thinking about recipes and algorithms becomes very important when we deal with new technologies, because after all, the machines need algorithms to create recipes. So there is a translation of instruction, of knowledge into algorithms, and then the transformation of algorithms into things that can be made. And one very important element is sometimes it might happen that this embodied element might be transformed in algorithm, because now, you know, there have been experiments where chefs have been asked to wear sensors on their body while cooking, and their movement has been translated into algorithms so that a robot can repeat them. There are machines that now can smell. And so once you figure out, okay, this is the smell of the cookie at the right point of baking, the machine can translate that into an algorithm, into a string of instruction that can help making, I don't know, this cookie in large quantities. So I would finish here. As I said, you know, this is just the beginning of the reflections. I'm glad I had the opportunity to share with you guys, and any feedback is more than welcome, because, you know, when you start working on new things, collaboration and workshopping, brainstorming, it's quite fundamental. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so very much.
So I'm just going to throw something out because there were lots of interesting similarities and themes that ran through these 3 papers. And I just have a lot of questions in my head that I don't know that are specifically for you, but the whole room, but I think you'll all have something to say anyways. So I guess my question is how to trace the heritage of these things if so much of it is actually embodied. And I was struck here about the Chinese cookbook that came after 10 years of famine, and it's the memory of those recipes that had been embodied by somebody. And I was also struck too about, you know, how do we know when something was used? And although you're tracking the indications of use, I find with the early modern period, it might be more problematic because so many of them were good copies of books, and the places where they tested out the ideas are missing. And so that's something that is also complicated there too. I was also thinking about what gets remembered, and your lovely gingerbread recipe, which is a celebration recipe, and what Fabio was talking about with, cooking with his mother as well, and these things that suddenly have lots of additions that weren't necessarily in the written work. But at the same time, you gave the example of the eggplant recipe, which you used once. We know that because you hadn't opened the book for 5 years. So I guess it's sort of a series of thoughts about what role does memory play here, especially of meals remembered, enjoyed, and celebrated when it comes to heritage versus maybe the everyday that is often a bit harder to track. And, you get the occasional book of the meals 10 years after the famine because they were so memorable in hindsight, but at the time they probably wouldn't have bothered. So just throwing some things out there.
Go for it, Fabio.
Okay, thank you. I don't know where to go. I think this leads us to think of what we mean by heritage. And that's a big discussion. Do we think about heritage as something that is unchanging, essential, or are we thinking about living heritage that changes over time? And of course, memory plays a central role in this kind of embodied experience, because once you learn not only the information, but the way you move your body in a space becomes part of your memories. And memories are never neutral. This is, again, neuroscience. Memories are made and retrieved in ways that are deeply emotional, so that memories are never the same. It's not like a computer when you have a file, you put it there, you leave it sit there, and unless the computer breaks down, you can retrieve it. That's not how our memories work. They're inscribed and retrieved through emotional states that also depend deeply on the body. And I think if we take this into consideration, thinking about how heritage changes over time and the attempt at inscribing heritage in something like, the UNESCO intangible cultural heritage or a geographical indication, or since we are in Pollenzo, a slow food presidium can interfere. What do they bring to the game, to this sort of transmission of knowledge? These are, of course, open questions, but I think they're worth reflecting.
Sorry, okay. So that's a great question, and I agree with Fabio that you have to think, what do you even mean by heritage? And whenever I hear that term, I'm always suspicious, because coming from a Chinese historical background, you're always hearing 5,000 years of continuous written history, which is both annoying and true. So, there's like, but when I'm thinking about that, I'm very struck, especially after listening to Fabio's presentation, on how little probably Chinese are concerned with the actual food itself or the actual act of making it. It's so deeply inscribed in the written word itself, because the language looks the same over thousands of years, and it has, this meaning that can be parsed, even if the words themselves may change their meaning. Like, I think it's so deeply embedded in the written text itself. So if you think about heritage in the Chinese context of food, it's in the written text. It's in the writing about the food that the heritage adheres, because we do not eat the same, even though there have been attempts to put Confucian cuisine up for the ICH nominations. Like, that's balderdash. We do not eat that way. Whatever they've reconstructed is completely fabrication or an imagination. But I think the idea of the text itself holding sway, that is, if you wanted to think about a Chinese heritage, it's inherent in the text. So much overpowering embodiment or orality or any of it, I think, is the written part. That's what I would say.
Interesting. I guess I would also add, in preparation for this paper, I read an article that I don't think I cited, but I've been thinking a lot about ever since, which was showing that once a recipe gets stamped with the designation of a heritage recipe, that moment has pretty much passed. It's basically capturing something that has been overtaken by modernity or industrialization or immigration or, you know, influx of something that's changed something. And so that moment of creating that recipe or promoting it or designating it as heritage is sort of entombing it or something, you know, and I think that's really true. That is a moment that we are trying to capture or prevent from disappearing. And so some of these recipes, the gingerbread recipe is, you know, we have celebratory recipes that we make once in a while, and then we have everyday food that we cook that maybe we don't even have a recipe for. And the designation of heritage is helping us remember, I guess, or capture that. So that's my thought.
So I'm wondering, Fabio, about your use of the word assemblage, if you are also treating it as assemblage. So using the assemblage as the anthropological ritual studies folkloristic use of assemblage, meaning that all these different parts are put together. They all have their own meanings. When you juxtapose them, it creates new meanings, it creates contrast that makes you suddenly see a meaning that was there that you were not thinking of. You know, and you know, so if you take that approach to assemblage, you can really see how recipes are bringing in so many different experiences and meanings, evoking emotions that they might not do for someone else. You know, so with Amy's gingerbread houses, if you take that gingerbread and then make something for the 4th of July, you're suddenly creating a new statement. It might be the same recipe, but the meanings are different for your children because of their experiences. So it gives a whole different way of looking at recipes, I think. And I wanted to ask about, with heritage, we usually think of heritage as an interpretation, a selection of events, imagined events sometimes, and then an interpretation of those events. And then that interpretation gives a perception, a definition of the identity in the present and in the future. So, you know, going back to assemblage, it really offers a very rich kind of metaphor or framework for looking at recipes. So thank you, Fabio. I don't know if that was built into your theorizing.
No, it is. That's why I mentioned the situational map tools. That's what a situational map does. It's trying to make sense of all the elements, explicit, implicit, memories, discursive, material. It's necessary because this sort of ideal type recipe then becomes something in a specific context. So it is, the way I use the concept is, it is deeply ethnographic. It's not, you know, I built on Latour and Law, but what does it mean when you're doing ethnography of cooking? And it helps you do this jump from the abstract string of instructions into something that, because it's complex, because it's contextual, generates meaning all the time.
Thank you to the three panelists, and I really enjoyed this panel, and I think your panel collectively points to some of the alternative and diverse functions of recipe collections beyond simply the pragmatic need to use it to cook. So I love Amy's examples, but I think food stains and also the found objects, they point to traces of reading the book and not necessarily practicing or cooking with it, even though in your case, definitely you are using it for cookery. But then I'm thinking of some of the early modern fashion of owning the so-called know-how practical manuals, because they give you a sense of certainty, even though you might not necessarily be using it to practice to make all those things. And then also Michelle's examples about the ritual use of the recipes, buried in tombs as like the text standing in for the material objects themselves, and also how Yuan Mei used cookbooks for social distinction via constructing or expressing taste. So I was wondering, how about thinking about recipe collections beyond simply the practical concerns?
I think that's definitely true. Just a quick comment. I mean, I think there's a lot more to learn about how people use cookbooks and what they mean to them. And I know there's a lot of people that buy cookbooks to read as novels, for instance, or they're put by their bedside, or a coffee table. The idea of a coffee table cookbook is so interesting. That's clearly not meant to be cooked from. So I think you're right that evidence of a recipe and even tears or stains doesn't give us a really full picture about how it was used or whether it was used.
And I think I would add, in thinking about, I thought to myself, oh, that's really interesting that Yuan Mei's cookbook or book of recipes, his book of taste, has been reprinted so many times, right? It's so popular, and yet if you look at, there's no way that people are reading Qiming Yaoshu on their bedsides. It's only scholars, right? It's not only is it really long, it's just different. And so it's sort of the why of it is also and which cookbooks are popular, right? It's the ones where you kind of hear the voice, or you can think of the person if you know who the person is, right? Those are the kinds of cookbooks that kind of remain in circulation. So thinking about that kind of idea of voice and the purpose of it, I think, is something else I would add.
Oh, can I just give one example? I was just at a friend's daughter's wedding a couple weekends ago, and instead of like a guest registry, they had a big, beautiful cookbook, and they said, find a recipe that you like and sign your name and tell us a little bit about what you like about that recipe. And I thought that was kind of brilliant and an interesting way of thinking about recipes and cookbooks that, in this instance, didn't have anything to do with cooking it.
What did you choose?
Oh, actually, it was like a savory leek goat cheese arugula, something like that. So something weird but also interesting. I don't know. I had to hurry because there were people in line behind me.
So thank you all for amazing talks. This was an auspicious transition because I was very interested in the question of the paratext. If you think about that, if you move it back into a pre or early modern context, there would be a significant difference understood between a paratext and marginalia. So I think what you're looking at is really marginalia more than anything else. And the distinction, the Quixote that you were talking about, is a very good counterexample, because there's Cervantes, the way he created his text, then there's who publishes it and the apparatus that they choose to place around that and how that directs our understanding of that text. And then there's the interaction between the reader and the actual object. And in fact, one of the things that in an early modern context would signal to you the importance of a book would be someone's physical interaction with it, right? An important text has commentary, both handwritten often if it came from someone's private library, as well as substantial commentary tradition around it. And it makes me think a lot about how we understand the cookbook or a recipe collection as either literature or not, right? And then who it belongs to, and that points us towards that, I think, back towards what we talked about before in terms of heritage preservation, because in the case of a great author and a great book, one of the things that defines that is the fact that we're not afraid of it being diluted. No one can, no matter how many times they manipulate it, nobody makes the Divine Comedy any less Dante's. And in the case of the cookbooks that that are so much a part of this interactive space, they are no one's and not necessarily able to be held on to in that way. And I have no particular position on this other than I'm very interested in how your talks all spoke to that. So thank you.
Yeah, just quickly, yes, you're right. This idea of marginalia, and I guess I'm arguing for marginalia to be read and analyzed as paratext and making that connection. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question. Yep.
Thanks very much for a lovely talk. Maybe looking to future non-cookbook cookbooks. And I suppose I was struck by Fabio's, your last image there of the hand and the robot. If we think about maybe what do we think a paratext would be for a robotic chef? And thinking that sort of what would we think it might look like, but also what would we like it to be? As we're now thinking about AI systems, technology systems, using digital recipes, what would we like to see these systems give us as paratext, in the same way as we're discussing how cooks used recipe books? What would we like to see maybe from AI systems when they are creating recipes for us?
Fabio?
I mean, that opens all sorts of possibilities. Think about 3D design, 3D printing with food. Think about, I don't know, food recognitions through cameras. Of course, as we interact with these new technologies, we'll create new ways to deal with it and also give meaning. Maybe that sort of cooking will not respond to the same needs as a cookbook, but maybe it will create new experiences that we have not thought about yet. I mean, 15 years ago, who would have thought that a way of spending time would be, doom scrolling? And now it's part of our life. So as these new technologies develop, I think that there might be emerging uses and meanings and ways of dealing with it.
I think it makes me think of Dan and Jeff's presentation this morning, like the ultimate reproducible, cooking recipe is a robot to do it exactly the same way every time, no different. And I think it would be really interesting, a kind of thought experiment is like, can you introduce the kind of things that Amy is talking about, introduce the improvements? Can you introduce some novelty? Can you introduce something different that, that's what robots presumably are not good at, but that's the creative part. Like maybe AI, if you let it do some crazy scramble thing, it will come up with some new, and I know there are chefs who are experimenting probably with AI and everything like that, but that to me would be the most curious part, is like, what completely new, wacky, zany combination or whatever could AI come up with that, a human chef is too bounded by tradition and prior knowledge to think of. Maybe that's not a good use of AI because they're so bounded by what already exists. But anyway,
right, it's already,
yeah.
Oh, they already tried that. IBM partnered with the Institute of Culinary Education a few years ago. I think it was 2015. And they had their IE Watson create recipes. So they fed the system tons of recipes. The system broke them down and then tried to reconstitute them in ways that responded to different priorities, like speed or, I don't know, emotion and so it was interesting, though, that in the end, it was the chefs at the school that had to interpret what the AI had spat out, because otherwise it wouldn't make much sense. So that was this kind of new interactions that emerged that nobody thought would have any sense.
Dan, you want to say something?
Just really, really quickly.
Yeah, really quick.
When we're thinking about Paratext as we start thinking about things like the robotic. In some ways, you have to start moving beyond sort of textual things and start thinking about, for example, fast food and what are the paratexts for the fast food recipe, because that really is, as we've arrived at in the broadest non-conceptual sense, the most mechanically reproducible. So then you start thinking about, you know, the bits of hamburgers that have been cooked too much so that they become waste. You start thinking about the paratext of human scars as potentially expanding what we think about as paratext. Anyway, just
Okay. Thank you so very much to the three panelists. Another terrific session, if you ask me. And applause. Thank you. Special thanks to Fabio. Thank you so very much.